Hello, students. I am excited to have my friend and colleague Ron with us today to talk about performing and engagement. And we are just going to jump right in with Ron. And I would love for you to tell the students briefly about yourself, your education, your career background, and then maybe one fun fact that you would want to divulge to the students there.
Certainly. Thank you for the warm introduction, Joe. So as you said, I am Ron Zelaya. I'm an internal audit manager currently at Promorse. It is a construction company that deals with a lot of the solar panels. So if you're on a highway in the middle of nowhere going and you see a huge solar farm, that is probably our project that we're working on. So I started my career in accounting. I graduated from St. Mary's College of California in 2015, and I started in public accounting, working in regional accounting firms, not Big Four, but the top 25 regional firms, as you'll probably understand them when you go through your auditing class. My primary focus was manufacturing, distribution, technology, and some government work as well. About 4 years of doing public accounting, I decided to challenge myself, and I moved to New York and took a consulting role where I was working on SOX readiness, and where we took small emerging companies that want to go public, either New York Stock Exchange or the Dow Jones, and we got them ready to be SOX compliant, and that is something I'm sure you'll be talking about in all your accounting classes. Unfortunately, that happened in 2019, and so when 2020 hit, the pandemic happened, and so a lot of our work got lost, and so I went back from New York back to Colorado, and that's kind of where I fell into internal audit, and where I was in what they called the special projects division, where we took a topic that management wants to get better an understanding of, or if it's a new process, we look at the process and tested it and produce results. And then after a couple of years there, I moved to this construction company where I'm at today. And a fun fact about me, I played baseball up to junior college. And what ended my career actually was I got hit by a pitch in the elbow. And so I've lost partial feeling in my right hand. And so if I punch a table like that, I cannot feel it. It's like partial. And so you'll sometimes see me when I'm presenting, like just feel my right hand randomly. And it's because I just oh yeah, there's something there.
Oh,
yeah.
well, now I even learned something new about you. So
Yeah.
this is why I'm asking everybody. Well, that's crazy. So good. Thanks for sharing that with all of us. So
no problem.
the students have already done a module on planning and engagement. So I love that you're, I'm not going to say new to internal audit, but I bet all of this is pretty fresh for you. So we've moved on to performing and engagement. And I would just like you to tell the students what you feel like, what is the first step in performing an audit, whether that's assurance or advisory, whatever type of example engagement in the real world? What would you say the first step is?
Yeah. So I have a lot of staff when they kind of get hopped into the audit or the project right at when field work starts, and that's when they're planning or when they're performing the audit plan. And the one thing I always tell them first thing to do is to really understand the objectives. So in the planning, you typically list all the things you want to accomplish in the audit. And although we try making it as specific as possible, there's sometimes some broadness to it. And I think it's really important for the person who is doing the testing to really understand what they're going after, because once you get into the actual audit, there's a lot of things that you can go sideways in. And I remember I had a project over inventory where we were trying to focus on one thing, but then we kind of got into this rabbit hole and we ended up spending months on a project where we didn't really need to do because we kind of strayed away from the objective. And so every time I start a new project with new staff, I always remind them, look at the objective. And if anytime you feel like you're straying away from it, to really talk back and ask questions on it, because internal audit, we would love to test everything and provide absolute assurance, but doing the real world, there are deadlines, and timeliness of reports is very important. There's oftentimes we have to what we call scope in on a certain objective and in certain parts of the company and just report on that. And our philosophy, at least in Promorse, is that any information is good information. And if we decide to do all of it and it took a year, it's not timely, it becomes irrelevant, and there are things that potentially change. So I've always told my students, or I don't say students, sorry, but my staff, to always understand the objective, because a lot of things can go wrong from there. And like I said, in planning, we try to make it as specific as possible, but there's always something that might go different once you're getting to the actual testing.
Yeah, I love that. And it kind of brings these students back to some of our first conversations, setting the objectives and then, finding the risks to getting those objectives. That's one of the first assignments that they really did. So I love that. And another thing that I talk about a lot, and even when my graduate students are auditing the university, the CFO constantly reminds them to not fall prey to scope creep. So
Yes.
you kind of hit that on the nail by saying, let's go back to the objectives every time. So the objectives are something we talk about in planning. We have those set, but first thing in performance, for Ron, great advice, make sure we're sticking to those objectives. That's why we do that planning process, right? So you mentioned the word testing, because we don't want to do too much testing that is irrelevant to our objectives, obviously. What types of audit testing or tests do you typically do during this phase of the audit? So we call the phases in our textbook, academia world, planning, performing, and communication, which I know, can be kind of interchangeable to planning, field work, and, results kind of. And
Yeah.
but in this performing or this field work testing stage, what kind of tests do you do in the real world?
Yeah. So you're going to hear this word a lot, especially if you go into internal audit world. It depends. It's very depending on the nature of the audit and the scope of the audit and what you're trying to accomplish. So a real world example, I am testing inventory. We're going to be doing what we call detail testing and analytical testing. So detail testing is kind of exactly how it sounds. We take a sample selection. Let's say it's $100,000 line items of inventory. We're going to pick 25 of them, judgmentally, statistical sampling, any type of sampling that you kind of deem fit, appropriate for the audit, and just testing what you're looking for and what the results are, and then concluding on that. That's kind of the basic one. That's one you'll always see, not only in internal audit, but if you go into public accounting or any other company, you'll probably get that the most. The more analytical testing is really just kind of coming up with a hypothesis of what you think the results should be, and then seeing if there's any trends in the data that might lead you astray, that might lead you to the conclusion. And if there's a variance between what your expectations are and what the results actually were, you kind of rely on that. And kind of, I don't want to go on a tangent too much, but that's one of the cool things about internal audit is that there's a lot of moving parts in the types of testing that you do. And it's just like such a wide range of topics that you can kind of dive into. And each test is kind of unique in its own. But those are, I would say, are the two broad ones. There's a third one that I like that we're kind of recently touching in, and that's more of the compliance testing. That's kind of the big one that's kind of coming up, especially as from a real world experience, construction audit, we're getting looked at by the DOL just for some employee stuff. And so we're just comparing what the DOL has, DOL stands for Department of Labor for your students. They're just comparing that to what our policies are and seeing if they match and if they, at least the policy responds to what the DOL requires from us. And
yeah, no, that's great. And those are great, perfect examples, I think, for the students. And I think we're going to talk a lot in our next segment together on data analytics, where you'll actually show the students what that analytical testing can kind of look like, which will be helpful, because I think what you all will begin to see is how much more you can get out of looking at whole populations of data versus doing that sample of 25, which I know Ron will agree that's kind of where our profession is wanting to move more. So
correct.
He's going to demystify data analytics for us in the next segment. So more to come on that. But thanks for explaining kind of some real world tests there. And you mentioned, you're really going through, you're probably tick marking that word, that horrible word on, are our inventory, numbers right? Yes or no? Is it accurate? Those kind of tick marks. And then you're obviously documenting that somewhere. So where does your company document that? Obviously there's some software out there specific for audits. And then a lot of audit shops still just use, Excel or Word, so what do you do in the real world?
Yeah, so my current company uses Audit Board right now. It's a pretty interactive software. I'm actually very impressed by it. It's one of the more sophisticated softwares I've used in internal audit. But historically, there is a program called HiBond that I use for SOX testing, and Teammate as well is another program. So from my experience, there's always been an audit software that we can use to document all of our findings and our observations and anything. And when I say documenting and what we need to retain in the file, there's really 4 things that we look for in a work paper within Audit Board and HiBond or any audit software that you use to kind of communicate to management. That's the criteria, like what management thinks the process is, the condition, how we found it, and then what caused the difference between management's expectations and what we found, and then the effect. We try to quantify it, and all of that is documented in those files, and that is our backbone. And if management wants to ask, like, hey, can we see the results? We usually point them to that file, and they can easily access it. But going back to your original question too, of like what we've seen, I have many friends and also in internal audit, they still are using Excel, tracking everything, which I don't know how they do it. It's, if you guys get into this field, guys and girls get into this field, there is a lot of documentation that happens in just one audit. And so the fact that people are still using Excel is impressive, and they are very organized. But, I think the next 5 or 10 years, I think every relevant big company will be going into Audit Board, HiBond, any type of audit software, because the demand from management of what they want to see from internal audit is just getting more and more as they understand what internal audit does, that I can't imagine it being done in Excel anymore. But
yeah, I have one client that we use Excel for testing and we upload it to SharePoint. So we use that system as a repository, not as like actual, it just kind of holds all of our work papers, but we're using Microsoft Excel as the tool. So, and the students will get to see some of that in some of their project work in this class. So I appreciate you explaining that. And I think one of the things I'd like to say is, someone has to be able to come behind us and re-perform our work. And so that's kind of, to me, the highlight of why we document our work. Not only, like you said, to prove to management if we have a finding how we got there, but then if we ever go through a quality assurance review or anything else, someone could come behind us and see what we did very easily. So that's the purpose of really documentation within this performing stage. So it's sadly not enough to just do it. We have to prove that we did it, right, as auditors.
Correct. Yeah, management, if there's something that management does not like in terms of your finding, they will ask you for every single little piece of information you got to make sure that your conclusion's right. Because if we find a problem with their process, that's more work for them, and they often don't like to do more work. And so that's why we have to back it up.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think, we've hit a lot of the high points with performing. I want to leave the students with just kind of one final question for you, which is, if you could go back and talk to college Ron, what would you say to him? What piece of advice or tip or anything? It can be personal, it can be professional. What would you say for the student?
I was thinking about this question a lot when you presented to me before. And honestly, I don't know. I guess the biggest thing I would say to students in terms of if they want to get into accounting in general is to really understand that in the workplace right now, the demand right now is a lot of making sure that the student can think for themselves and like really understand go into the testing or any type of thing that they're doing head first and be willing to just try everything out. As we're getting new staff from colleges, and the students, a lot of them are terrified of making a mistake, and they're kind of like hesitant to do anything. And for me, it's not necessarily a problem. It gives me an opportunity to train, but there are moments of like, this will make a lot more sense if you at least tried it first to kind of get through your own process, because that would help me understand how did you get to this? How did you get to the point where you can like work with the process that you're doing, how you got there? Oh, that makes no sense. You can cut that out. Sorry. Let me restart that question.
Yeah. You want to start over?
That particular thing, because what I'm trying to get to, and I don't care if you cut this or not, it'll be funny for the students, but what I'm trying to get at is that there's a lot of times where the students, they're coming from a huge academic background where there's a right or wrong answer. In internal audit, there is no right or wrong answer, and there are many different ways to get to the result that you are looking for. And I think for students who are coming into the real world, they're terrified of like, there has to be a right answer. There in internal audit specifically, there is no right. And I'll say even more specifically, even the operational side, the special project side, there is no right answer. There's always going to be some type of gray. And the ability for students to be able to like accept that they might not know everything, there might not be a right answer, would be so helpful in their career. And that would give me a confidence in them. They're like, okay, maybe he won't get it right. He or she won't get it right the first time, but I know the next process is very similar to that. They'll understand it and they'll knock it out of the park.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great advice. I mean, I used to tell my staff similar things. It's like, if you walked into my office and said, so here's what I'm thinking I'm
Oh
going to
yeah,
do, but what do you think? I'm much more likely to respond than like, how should I do this? Right? Those are two different ways to walk into an office. And I think that's brilliant advice that you just left them with. So I may not cut that out because I think it's good that they see real world and hey, this is taking the place of you all coming into the classroom and we can't cut any of that out in real life.
yeah.
So I appreciate you being real with us and spending time with us. And we'll see you again to talk about data analytics.
All right, pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.